The card room at Lady Frayne's summer house was thick with heat, and the smell of tallow candles burning low. And Selina Reeve sat at the table with her hands folded in her lap, while Lucius Calder, Duke of Stenmore, looked at her across the green baize, as though she were something that had crawled in under the door. She had felt that look before, in a dozen drawing rooms, at a dozen card tables. The particular expression worn by men of rank when they encountered a woman who was cleverer than they expected and proposed to do something about it. She had learned, over 39 years, not to flinch. She had learned to breathe slowly and let the cards speak instead. What she had not learned, what no amount of practice had quite prepared her for, was the moment Lucius Calder named Wrenfield Hall as his wager, said it in a clear voice before 12 witnesses, and looked at her with absolute certainty that she would fold. The room went quiet. Selina picked up her hand and looked at her cards, and her pulse, if anyone had thought to measure it, was steady. That evening had begun badly, and grown worse in the particular way that evenings at Lady Frayne's tended to. Too much wine served too early, too many people with too little to occupy them. And Crispin Calder working the room with the patient industry of a man who had come with a purpose. Selina had watched him do it from the doorway of the card room, where she stood with Lady Frayne's shawl over one arm and Lady Frayne's empty glass in her other hand, the two objects that defined her position in any room she entered. Crispin moved from cluster to cluster, leaning close, saying something that made each group glance toward the card table. And each glance carried the same quality: amused contempt, the expression of people who had been told something delicious about someone who deserved it. She had known, by the time she sat down, that Crispin had been working on Lucius for most of the evening. She had seen it in the set of Lucius's jaw when he first looked at her. Not the ordinary disdain of a duke encountering a lady's companion at a card table, but something sharper, something personal, as though he had been given a specific reason to find her offensive. Crispin had a gift for that. He found the particular wound in a man's pride and pressed it until the man did something rash. What she had not known was how far he intended to go. The game was whist, and they played 3 hands before Lucius said anything beyond the minimum required by courtesy. He played well. She noted that without surprise. Men of his type generally did, having had the leisure to practice. But he watched her hands between plays with the focused attention of someone looking for something specific. She kept her face pleasant and her movements unhurried, and she won the first hand and lost the second and won the third. And through all of it, Crispin sat to Lucius's left and said, at intervals, small things. Remarkable luck for a companion. And one wonders where she learned such facility. And most carefully, one hears her father was something of a... Well, one hears things. Lucius said nothing to any of this. He simply watched Selina's hands. You play with considerable confidence, Lucius said at last, between the third hand and the fourth. For a woman in your position. Selina set down her cards and looked at him directly. My position at this table, she said. Or my position in life? Both, Miss Reeve. Then I will answer for both, she said. At this table, my confidence comes from the cards I hold. In life, it comes from the fact that I have had a great deal of practice at being underestimated, and I find it rather useful. The room had been listening. A few people smiled. Lucius did not smile. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read, something that was not entirely contempt, though it dressed itself in contempt's clothing. And then Crispin said, very quietly, just loudly enough, perhaps a higher stake would test that confidence more thoroughly. Lucius held her gaze. Later, she would understand that he had been drinking since dinner, and that Crispin had been feeding that particular fire for hours, and that the combination of wine and wounded pride and a room full of witnesses was exactly the instrument Crispin had designed the evening to produce. In the moment, she saw only that Lucius had made a decision. "Wrenfield Hall?" Lucius said, "against whatever sum you care to name. One hand." The room went completely still. Selina looked at him. She was aware of every person in that room, of the heat of the candles, of the faint sound of music from the floor below, of Lady Frayne's glass still on the sideboard where she had set it down. She thought of the 12 faces watching her, and she thought of what it would mean to refuse. The county would say she had lost her nerve, that she had known she couldn't win honestly, that the confidence was performance all along. She thought of Tibby asleep upstairs in the room Lady Frayne had grudgingly provided, and she thought of her father, who had taught her every game he knew and lost everything he owned. And she thought, "He is doing this to humiliate you. He is certain you will fold." "Very well," she said. She won in 7 minutes. The room did not make a sound. Lucius sat perfectly still for a moment, looking at his cards, and then he reached across the table. Slowly, deliberately, the gesture of a man who expected to find something. And his hand moved toward hers where it rested on the baize. She understood what he was looking for. The tremor of guilt, the physical evidence of a cheat, the involuntary confession that his pride required. She withdrew her fingers before he reached them. What he caught instead was a brief, clear view of her wrist, the pulse there visible and entirely unhurried, and her eyes when she raised them to his were level and without triumph. She turned to Lady Frayne, who stood at the edge of the room with an expression of profound social alarm. "Would you like more wine, my lady?" Selina asked. She did not sell Wrenfield. She thought about it for one night, lying in the narrow bed in Lady Frayne's guest room with Tibby warm and heavy against her side, working through the arithmetic of what the estate might fetch and what that sum would mean. And by morning, she had decided against it. To sell immediately would allow the county to construct a narrative in which Selina Reeve had never intended to claim what she earned. She had simply wanted the money, which made her a schemer rather than a winner. And the distinction mattered. She had spent her whole life being called one thing when she was another, and she was tired of it. "We are going north," she told Tibby at breakfast. Tibby, who was 7 and had an opinion about everything, considered this. "Is it far? Far enough? Will there be a garden?" "I believe there will." Tibby said that she approved and ate her toast, and that was the end of the discussion. Lady Frayne's blessing was as grudging as Selina had expected. She stood in the doorway of her morning room and looked at Selina with the expression of a woman who has been inconvenienced by someone else's competence. "You understand," Lady Frayne said, "that this will make you a great many enemies." "I have a great many enemies already," Selina said. "At least now I will have somewhere comfortable to receive them." Lady Frayne made a sound that was almost a laugh, and gave her a letter of introduction to the vicar's wife at the village near Wrenfield, which was the most warmth she had ever shown Selina in 6 years of service. Selina accepted it, thanked her, and left. The estate steward, a man named Hollis, who had served the Calders for 30 years and looked it, met her at the door of Wrenfield Hall with an expression of barely suppressed alarm. He was a compact, gray-haired man with the weathered face of someone who spent more time outdoors than in. And he looked at Selina the way a man looks at something unexpected that has landed in his careful, ordered world. "Miss Reeve," he said, and managed to make it sound both respectful and bewildered. "Mr. Hollis," she said. "I should like to see the accounts, if you please, and then the tenants' cottages. I understand there have been some difficulties with the East Row." He showed her everything without warmth and without obstruction, which she respected more than warmth would have been. The accounts were honest, and the difficulties with the East Row were real. 3 cottages with roofs that had been needing attention for 2 years and had not received it. She made notes. 8. Tibby, released into the grounds while the adults talked numbers, ran through the long grass of the south lawn with her arms out, and came back at tea time with grass stains on her dress and a look of absolute contentment. "I like it here," Tibby announced, presenting herself to Hollis as though her opinion were the deciding vote. "The dog in the stable yard has 3 legs, and he still runs very fast." Hollis looked at the child for a moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite warmth, but the beginning of a willingness to be won over. That evening, a letter arrived from Lady Frayne. It contained, among other things, the information that Crispin Calder's smile, upon hearing that Selina had not sold and had not fled, had gone cold in a way that Lady Frayne found, she wrote, rather more unsettling than his charm. Selina read the letter twice and put it in the top drawer of the library desk. An honest winner, she understood, was more dangerous to Crispin than a cheat would have been. A cheat could be exposed. An honest winner had to be destroyed by other means, and Crispin was already thinking about how. She went to check on Tibby and did not let herself think about it until morning. Lucius rode to Wrenfield on a Tuesday, which was the day his solicitor had told him the deed documents would need to be reviewed, and he told himself that was the only reason he was going. He had not slept well. He had not slept well since the card room at Lady Frayne's, which he attributed to the heat and not to the memory of a steady pulse and a level gaze that appeared uninvited whenever he closed his eyes. He expected to find her calculating. He had encountered women in difficult positions before, women who had acquired something of value by luck or circumstance, and who now wanted to be paid to release it quietly and without fuss. He had a figure in his head. He thought it was generous. She met him in the library, standing behind the desk with the account books open in front of her, and she did not look like a woman waiting to negotiate. "Miss Reeve," he said, "I have come to discuss the matter of Wrenfield." "I assumed as much," she said. "Please sit down." He did not sit. "I intend to purchase the estate back from you at a fair market price. My solicitor has prepared—" "I am not selling," she said. He stopped. "I beg your pardon?" "I am not selling Wrenfield," she said again, in the same tone she might use to explain something simple to someone who had missed it the first time. "I won it fairly. I intend to keep it, at least until I have determined what it needs and what should be done with it." Lucius looked at her for a moment. He had prepared for negotiation. He had not prepared for refusal. "The wager," he said, "was made under circumstances that were not entirely rational. I had been drinking, the social pressure of the evening. There were 12 witnesses," she said. She named them, all 12, in order, starting with Lady Frayne and ending with Crispin himself. "Which of them would you like to discredit first?" The silence that followed was not comfortable. "You are a woman of no property and no family standing," he said at last, and he heard the cruelty in it even as he said it, and said it anyway because it was true, and because he was angry. "You survived on card playing. That is not a foundation for—" "For what?" she said. "For owning property? For having an address that is not someone else's spare room?" She came around the desk then, and she was not a tall woman, but she stood as though she were, and she looked at him with an expression that was not anger. It was something more contained than anger, and more difficult to deflect. You call it honor when you do it. You call it theft when I do it. The only difference between your card table and mine, Your Grace, is who was permitted to sit at one by the accident of birth. He had no answer for that. He had answers ready, reasonable ones, legal ones, ones that would have worked in any other conversation. And she had walked directly past all of them to the thing underneath, and he could not find the words to push it back down. The deed transfer, he said finally, requires my steward to verify certain documents. I will need to remain in the area for several days. She looked at him steadily. There is an inn in the village, she said. I understand it is quite comfortable. He took a room at the inn. He told himself he would be gone by Thursday. Thursday came and went. The county assembly was held at the market town's assembly rooms on a Friday evening, and Selina went because to stay away would be to concede ground she had not agreed to give. She wore her best dress, which was 3 years old and well made, and she took Tibby as far as the door and delivered her to the vicar's wife, who had agreed to watch her for the evening. And she walked into the assembly rooms alone. Crispin was there. She had known he would be. She watched him work the room from her position near the windows. The same patient industry she had observed at Lady Frayne's, the same lean and whisper, the same quality of glance that followed in his wake. The word card cheat did not need to be spoken aloud to travel. She could see it moving from cluster to cluster in the slight changes of expression, the way conversations died when she approached and revived when she moved away. She was standing near the refreshment table, quite alone, when she felt the room begin to turn in earnest. The particular social phenomenon in which a crowd, having received a signal, shifts its orientation like a flock of birds. The nearest group of 3 women stopped speaking and looked at her with the specific blankness of people who have decided to look through rather than at. And then Lucius stepped half in front of her. She did not see him move. He was simply, suddenly there. Positioned between her and the nearest group, facing them, with the particular quality of stillness that very large men can deploy as a statement. He addressed the nearest woman directly. Lady Anscombe, he said, I understand there has been some question about the game at Lady Frayne's. I was present. The hand was witnessed by 12 people. The play was clean, and the wager was mine to make. If anyone in this room has a contrary account, I invite them to produce it. Lady Anscombe opened her mouth and closed it again. Lucius said nothing further. He did not look at Selina. He accepted a glass from a passing footman and turned to exchange a word with a man near the fireplace, as though the previous 30 seconds had been entirely unremarkable. Selina stood still for a moment, aware of a sensation she did not immediately identify. Something warm and unexpected arriving in a part of her that she kept carefully defended, and she recognized it with some alarm as the beginning of gratitude. She did not want to be grateful to Lucius Calder. Gratitude was the first step towards something she could not afford. She went to find Tibby and did not speak to him again that evening. 3 days later, Hollis raised the matter of the boundary dispute with the northeastern tenant, and Selina went to walk the estate line with him and with Lucius, who was still, inexplicably, in the area. The path along the eastern boundary was old and in poor repair, with sections of loose stone where the ground had shifted over successive winters. Hollis walked ahead, pointing out the markers, and Selina and Lucius followed at a slight distance. Lucius stumbled on a section of broken path, a loose stone that shifted under his boot, and he caught himself against nothing because there was nothing to catch, and he would have gone sideways into the ditch if Selina had not reached out and taken his arm without thinking. Her hand closed around his forearm, steadying him, and she felt the muscle beneath her fingers tense and then release as he found his footing. She left her hand where it was for a moment longer than she meant to. He did not move away. Neither of them said anything. Hollis continued walking ahead, describing the boundary marker, and after a beat that lasted somewhat longer than it should have, Selina released Lucius's arm, and they walked on. That evening at dinner, Tibby, who had appointed herself the social director of Wrenfield Hall in the absence of any higher authority, cornered Lucius at the far end of the table. "Can you do card tricks?" she asked. He replied simply, "No." "Aunt Selina can do 12. She taught me 4. "That is very accomplished of you both. Can you do even 1? Lucius shook his head. "No." Tibby regarded him with the patient skepticism of a 7-year-old who has been lied to before. "I think you probably can," she said. There was a pause. Selina, standing in the doorway with a cup of tea she had forgotten she was holding, watched Lucius look at the child with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Something that was not quite discomfort and not quite softness, but occupied the uncertain territory between them. He reached into his coat pocket. He produced a deck of cards from somewhere that surprised her. She had not known he carried one. And he set it on the table with the deliberateness of a man making a concession he has not entirely agreed to. He demonstrated one trick. It was a simple one. A find the card, competently done. And Tibby watched it with the focused attention of a natural student and immediately demanded to know how it was done. "I am not going to tell you," Lucius said. "Why not?" "Because half the value of a trick is that no one knows how you did it." Tibby considered this. "Aunt Selina always tells me how." "Then you are very lucky," Lucius said, and his voice had something in it that was not sarcasm. And Selina looked at the cup in her hand and looked away. Tibby woke at 2:30 in the morning, burning with fever. Selina heard her before she was fully awake. A small, confused sound from the room next door. The kind that a child makes when something is wrong and she does not yet have the words for it. She was out of bed and through the connecting door before she had found her slippers, and she put her hand on Tibby's forehead and felt the heat radiating from her skin with a force that drove everything else out of her mind. She sent the housemaid for Hollis and sent Hollis for the village surgeon. And Hollis came back in 10 minutes with the information that the road through the lower valley was flooded from the evening storm and the surgeon could not get through. Selina sat at the edge of Tibby's bed and held the child's hand and did not allow herself to think about what the fever meant or how high it might go. Because thinking about it would not help Tibby, and she needed everything she had for the work of keeping her calm and cool and breathing steadily. She did not know when Lucius left the house. She did not know he was gone until Hollis came to the door of the room and told her, in a tone of some bewilderment, that the Duke had ridden out 20 minutes ago into the storm. He came back 2 hours later. She heard the horse in the yard and then boots on the stairs, and then the door opened and Lucius came in with the surgeon behind him. Both of them soaked through, the surgeon looking as though he had been pulled from bed and put on a horse in the rain. Which was exactly what had happened. Lucius's coat was dark with water from the collar to the hem. He had ridden around the flooded road through the upper fields, which added 4 miles to the journey in each direction, in the dark, in a storm, and he offered no explanation for any of it. He simply stepped back from the doorway to let the surgeon through and stood against the wall while the examination was conducted. The fever was high, but not dangerous, the surgeon said. Keep her cool, keep her drinking, watch through the night. He would come back at first light. Selina sat in the chair beside Tibby's bed, and Lucius sat on the other side, and they watched the child sleep in the lamplight. The storm had quieted to a steady rain against the window. At some point, she could not have said when, Lucius's hand came to rest over hers where it lay at the edge of the cot, his fingers covering hers without pressure, without demand, simply there. She looked at his hand, and then at Tibby's face, and did not move away. She must have dozed in the chair, because she came back to herself with the gray light of early morning coming through the curtains and the sound of Hollis's voice at the door, very quiet, speaking to Lucius. She kept her eyes closed and her breathing even. "The transfer paperwork," Hollis was saying. "I thought you should see this, Your Grace. The old debt register. There is a name." A pause followed. "Reeve," Lucius said. His voice had changed. "Yes, Your Grace. Jonas Reeve. He was... Miss Reeve is his daughter." The quiet that came next stretched long enough to fill the room. "The debt," Lucius said. "What happened to it?" Hollis's voice was careful. "It was cancelled, Your Grace. Forgiven, not collected. There is a notation in Reeve's own hand returning the obligation. The marker was never presented. Wrenfield went back to the Calders because Jonas Reeve chose to give it back." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Selina's pretense of sleep became unnecessary. She could not have moved if she had tried. She lay still and listened to the sound of Lucius sitting with something that was dismantling him. And she did not open her eyes. By the time she genuinely woke, an hour later, Tibby's fever had broken. The child lay damp and exhausted and entirely herself. And Selina pressed her lips to her forehead and felt the relief of it move through her like water. When she looked up, Lucius was standing at the window with his back to the room, looking out at the garden, and he did not turn around. Crispin arrived at Wrenfield the following week with 2 county justices and a letter from a London solicitor. And he presented his accusation with the manner of a man who has been rehearsing it for some time. Card cheating, improper acquisition, a formal demand that the transfer be reversed and the estate returned. The justices stood to either side of him with the uncomfortable expressions of men who have been brought along to lend gravity to a situation they are not entirely certain of. Selina received them in the entrance hall. She listened to the full recitation without interrupting, and when Crispin had finished, she thanked him for his clarity and told the justices she would be in correspondence with her own solicitor within the week. 3 days later, Lucius received simultaneous summons. His banker, his family, and a letter from his cousin that was 3 pages long and used the word humiliation 11 times. He departed for London on a Thursday morning. He told Selina in the entrance hall that the legal process would resolve the matter and that his presence at Wrenfield served no practical purpose. She said, "Of course." She did not say anything else. She watched his horse out the gate from the library window and then turned back to the accounts and did not allow herself to examine what she felt, because examining it would require admitting that she had begun, against every piece of evidence and every rule she had made for herself, to expect something from him. That expectation was now a liability, and she needed to be clear-eyed. The campaign sharpened in his absence. Crispin visited Lady Frayne, and then 2 county matrons, and the argument he made was careful and never quite an accusation. That a woman with no formal income, no guardianship papers, and a reputation built on card playing was not a suitable home for a 7-year-old child. He identified a male cousin of Selina's late sister, a respectable man with a Bristol address and a wife and a house with a proper nursery. And he began corresponding with him. The cousin, whose name was Mr. Pemberton, wrote to Hollis asking about the child's welfare in terms that were politely worded and unmistakably pointed. Hollis brought Selina the letter on a Wednesday evening. She read it at the library desk, She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat very still for a moment, looking at the grain of the wood. And then she got up and went to Tibby's room and sat in the chair by the window in the dark while Tibby slept. She did not light a candle. She sat there until the village church clock struck 2, and then she got up and went back to bed. In the morning, Tibby spread her drawings across the library table. The estate, Hollis's 3-legged dog, a woman she had labeled Aunt Selina in large, uncertain letters, and a man in a dark coat with a deck of cards in his hand. The label beneath the man read the Duke, written with great seriousness. Selina looked at the drawings for a long moment. Then she gathered them carefully and put them in the top drawer of the desk and turned the key in the lock. Lucius's letter arrived that afternoon. It said only, "I am coming back." She read it twice. She placed it in the same drawer as the drawings. She went to find Hollis and asked him to watch for a horse on the northern road. And she did not allow herself to feel anything that could be called relief until Hollis came to the library door the following morning and said quietly that a rider had been seen at the top of the hill. She nodded. She finished the sentence she was writing in the accounts ledger. Then she put down her pen. The harvest supper filled the great hall at Wrenfield on a Saturday evening in September, and it was the same room, the same long tables, the same stone floor, the same windows looking out onto the south lawn, where the estate had changed hands over a card table on a suffocating summer night. Now it was hung with grain sheaves and lit with the warm light of a dozen lanterns, and the tenants of Wrenfield filled it from the fireplace to the door, with the particular noise of people who have been working hard and are glad to stop. Selina moved among them with Hollis at her shoulder, and she knew most of them by name now. And 3 of the children ran to her when she came through the door, which was the kind of thing that she did not let herself think about too carefully, because thinking about it made her chest do something inconvenient. Lucius was already there. He had arrived 2 hours before the supper and gone directly to speak with the tenants from the East Row, whose roofs had been repaired in August, and she had seen him in conversation with the eldest of them, a man named Sayers, who had been deeply skeptical of Selina's arrival and had come around by degrees, the way cautious people do, with an expression on his face that she recognized as genuine listening, which was not something she had expected from him in the early weeks. Crispin arrived at 7:30 with a magistrate from the county seat and 2 men she did not recognize, and the quality of the room changed the moment he walked in. The particular drop in temperature that a predatory intention produces in a crowded space. The tenants nearest the door felt it and went quiet, and the quiet spread outward until half the room had stopped talking. Crispin stood at the center of the hall and delivered his accusation to the magistrate in a voice pitched to carry. Card cheating, improper acquisition, a demand that the transfer be reversed, the estate returned, and a formal proceeding opened before the magistrate then present. He produced the London solicitor's letter. He produced a statement from a man who claimed to have seen Selina mark a card, a man she had never met, whose name appeared on no witness list from Lady Frayne's card room, and who was not present to be questioned. The hall was very quiet. Selina stood at the head of the room and looked at Crispin. She was aware of every face turned toward her. The tenants, the magistrate, the 2 strangers, Hollis standing to her left, with his hands clasped behind his back. She was aware of the weight of the room, the accumulated attention of 50 people waiting to see what she would do. She reached into her bodice and took out a folded document. She crossed the room to the magistrate and placed it in his hands. "This is a debt marker," she said. "It is 30 years old. It bears the seal of the late Duke of Stenmore and the signature of my father, Jonas Reeve, in the notation of a cancelled debt. Forgiven, not collected, with my father's own note returning the obligation. Wrenfield went back to the Calders because my father gave it back. He was owed it, and he returned it without condition. The magistrate opened the document. He read it. His expression changed. Hollis stepped forward. "I can confirm the provenance of that document," he said. "It was in the estate records. I have served this house for 30 years, and I can tell you that the debt it represents was discharged by Jonas Reeve without payment. The man who told the late Duke that he had been ruined by Reeve was lying. I know whose father told that lie." He looked at Crispin when he said it. The room followed his eyes. Crispin's face went very still. The magistrate lowered the document and looked around the hall with the expression of a man who has arrived expecting one kind of proceeding and found himself in a different one entirely. And then Lucius stood up. He had been sitting on a bench near the middle of the room, not at the high table, not set apart from the tenants, simply among them as one person among many. And he stood up with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided something and intends to say it aloud regardless of what it costs. He was a tall man, and the hall was lit with warm light, and every person in the room could see him clearly. He looked at Crispin first. "My father believed for 30 years that Jonas Reeve ruined him," Lucius said. "He believed it because he was told it by a man he trusted, and it was a lie. The debt was cancelled. The estate was returned voluntarily. My father's hatred was built on a false account, and I inherited that hatred and held it as though it were a principle." He paused. It was not a principle. It was grief that had been pointed at the wrong man. The hall was completely still. "I entered the wager at Lady Frayne's willingly," he said. "I was goaded into it, and I allowed myself to be goaded. Because I was proud, and because I had been drinking, and because I wanted an excuse to humiliate someone I had already decided to despise. The game was played honestly. The hand was clean." He looked at the magistrate now, and his voice did not waver. "I will not pursue recovery of Wrenfield by law, by family pressure, or by any other means. The woman who won it is more fit to hold it than I was. I will sign whatever document you require to confirm that." He sat down. The magistrate looked at the debt marker in his hands. He looked at Crispin. He looked at the room. Crispin left without sitting down. He walked to the door and through it, and the two strangers went with him. And the sound of the door closing behind them was the quietest sound Selina had ever heard. The magistrate folded his papers and put them in his coat. He said, to no one in particular, that he did not believe his presence was further required, and he accepted a cup of cider from a passing tenant and found a seat near the fireplace. And the hall slowly, unevenly, like a fire catching, came back to life around him. The tenants were the last to leave, and they left slowly, with the reluctance of people who have had a good evening and know it. And by the time the hall was empty, the lanterns had burned down to a warm amber, and the grain sheaves cast long shadows on the stone floor. Hollis extinguished the lamps near the door, and then, with the tact of a man who has learned to read a room, left without saying good night. Selina stood near the window. Lucius stood by the fireplace. The distance between them was perhaps 12 feet, and felt, in the quiet of the empty hall, like something that could be crossed or not crossed, and both possibilities were present at once. "The trust documents," she said. "I have already had them drawn up. Wrenfield's revenues go into stewardship, for the tenant's maintenance and for Tibby's inheritance. I am not keeping it as property." Lucius looked at her. "Hollis told me," he said. He told me the night of Tibby's fever, when he showed me the marker. I sat with both things at once, who you were and what you intended to do. And the story I had been telling myself about you did not survive it. What story was that? That you were what I needed you to be, he said. Calculating, grasping, someone I could dismiss. He moved away from the fireplace, not toward her, but to the side as though he needed the movement. I have hated your father since I was a boy. I held that hatred like a debt that was owed to me, and Jonas Reeve was a better man than mine. Selina was quiet for a moment. He taught me every game he knew, she said. He lost everything, and he taught me the only thing he had left to give. I spent 20 years being ashamed of that, and then I stopped. She looked at him directly. He forgave a debt he was owed because he thought it was the right thing to do. He didn't tell anyone. He just did it and let your father go on hating him, because he thought the man needed the story more than he needed the truth. Lucius stood still. She crossed the 12 feet between them and kissed him once, slowly, with her hands at her sides and her eyes open. Not as absolution, not as gratitude, but as a decision made by a woman who has weighed the evidence and chosen, against her own long habit of caution, to risk being known. She felt him go very still, and then she felt him breathe. And then his hand came up and rested at her jaw with a gentleness that she had not expected from him, and that undid something she had been holding carefully in place for a very long time. She stepped back. She looked at him. 1 year, she said. Give me 1 year to see what this is, without either of us deciding in advance what it means. He answered without hesitation. Yes. She nodded. She picked up her shawl from the back of a chair. At the door, she stopped and looked back at him, standing in the amber light of the last burning lantern. And she thought that whatever she had expected from the evening at Lady Frayne's card table, it had not been this. She went upstairs to check on Tibby. 1 year later, the harvest supper filled the great hall at Wrenfield again, now as an annual custom established by the new trust, a fact that Hollis had recorded in the estate ledger with quiet satisfaction. The grain sheaves were back, and the lanterns, and the noise of 50 people glad to be there. And Selina moved among the tenants with Hollis at her shoulder and knew all of them by name now, and several of their children's names as well. And the youngest of the East Row families had named their new baby girl after her, which she had received with an equanimity that had lasted until she was alone in the library, and then had not lasted at all. In the corner near the window, at a small table that had been set there specifically for the purpose, Lucius sat with Tibby and a deck of cards. He was teaching her a simple game, and he was losing every hand. He was losing with the elaborate, transparent bad faith of a man who has decided to lose but cannot quite bring himself to do it gracefully. Overcorrecting his bluffs, holding winning cards too long, folding on hands that Tibby could see were good from across the table. Tibby, who had inherited her great-uncle's gift and her aunt's eye for a false tell, was delighted. She won each hand with the focused pleasure of a child who knows she is being indulged and is enjoying it anyway. Selina watched from near the fireplace. She watched Lucius fold a clearly winning hand with an expression of theatrical defeat. And she watched Tibby collect the cards with the brisk competence of someone who has been winning all evening and expects to keep winning. And she laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes without warning and cannot be recalled. And the sound of it carried across the room. Lucius looked up from the table. He found her immediately, across the crowded hall, through the noise and the lamplight and the movement of 50 people between them. And he looked at her laughing at him, and he did not look away. He held her gaze with an expression she had learned to read over the course of a year. The one he wore when he was not performing anything, when the imperious manner and the careful control had been set down, and he was simply himself. A man who had been wrong about a great many things and was working, with more effort than elegance, to become something better. Tibby said something to him. He looked back down at the cards. He shuffled with exaggerated seriousness and dealt a new hand. And Tibby picked up her cards and examined them with the gravity of a natural card player. And Selina looked at the two of them in the corner of the hall, the Duke failing to cheat a child, the child winning with complete serenity, and felt something settle in her that had not been settled in a very long time. The cards, the house, the man, everything that had once been a weapon, turned to something else entirely. She went to join them at the table,